Steve here at blessedhopeforever.com. Today we're going to talk about Samson. And how that may relate to end times prophecy. Is there a Bible verse that speaks of Samson in the context of Philistines in modern day Gaza? I think so. The biblical account of Samson and the Philistines, we see that in the book of Judges, primarily in chapters 13 through 16. These verses describe Samson's life as a judge of Israel and his conflicts with the Philistines who were oppressing them, oppressing the Israelites at the time. Specifically, the city of Gaza is mentioned several times in relation to Samson and the Philistines. I find that very interesting. In Judges chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, Samson goes to Gaza and escapes an ambush by the Gazites by pulling up the city gates and carrying them up, toting them up to a hill near Hebron. And in Judges 16:21, after being betrayed by Delilah and losing his strength, the Philistines seize Samson, they gouge out his eyes, and they take him to Gaza. And there they bind him with bronze chains, and they force him to grind grain in the prison. In Judges chapter 16, the Philistine rulers in Gaza hold a celebration in the temple of their god, Dagon, to praise him for their victory over Samson. They bring a blinded Samson out to entertain them. That's interesting. And Samson prays for strength one last time, pushes on the two central pillars of the temple and causes it to collapse, killing himself and thousands of Philistines. The biblical text refers to the Philistines as the inhabitants of a region that included 5 major city-states, one of which was Gaza. Now, Dagon was an ancient Semitic god with a complex history and multiple interpretations of his name exist. He was worshipped across the ancient Middle East, particularly in Mesopotamia, Syria, and among the Philistines. Dagon's cult is attested as early as the 23rd century BC in the region of the Euphrates River, where he was considered a god king and a creator figure. He was a major deity for the Amorites and was later adopted by the Philistines as their national god. He's often identified as the father of the god Baal. He's widely regarded as a deity of agriculture, vegetation, and fertility. His role as a god of grain is supported by ancient texts, and he's often cited as the inventor of the plow. That would have interested my great-grandfather and grandfather. The biblical account of the Ark of the Covenant being placed in his temple in Ashdod, we read about that in 1 Samuel 5, also describes the idol falling and its head and hands being broken off. In the Bible, Dagon is mentioned primarily in the book of Judges and 1 Samuel as the god of the Philistines. His temples are rooted in the cities of Gaza and Ashdod. The most famous biblical account is in 1 Samuel 5, where the captured Ark of the Covenant is placed next to the idol of Dagon in his temple in Ashdod. The next morning, the idol is found fallen face down before the Ark, and the following day, it's not only fallen, but also broken with its head and hands severed, symbolizing the defeat of Dagon by the God of Israel. You got to find that interesting. Samson's final act of pulling down the temple in Gaza destroys the house of Dagon and kills his worshipers. I think that this has serious prophetic implications. I'm not the only one that does. The story of Samson is rich with prophetic and symbolic implications, particularly when viewed through the modern day lens. Of course, there's the obvious type there with Christ. I'll talk about that. Many Bible teachers and theologians interpret his life as a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ in the broader struggle between good and evil. He is a prophetic figure. Samson, without a doubt, is a prophetic figure. The parallels between Samson and Jesus are quite remarkable. Both of their births were announced by an angel to their mothers, and both were destined to save God's people. The angel of the Lord tells Samson's mother that her son will begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Judges 13:5. In a similar way, an angel tells Mary that she'll give birth to a son, Jesus, because he'll save his people from their sins. Matthew 1:21. So both were set apart for a specific divine purpose from birth. And then there's the betrayal for a price. Samson's betrayal by Delilah is seen as a parallel of Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus. That's right. Delilah is paid by the Philistine rulers to reveal the secret of Samson's strength, just as Judas is paid 30 pieces of silver to hand over Jesus by the chief priests to hand over Jesus. Samson's final act is a powerful symbol of self-sacrifice. Powerful symbol of self-sacrifice. He willingly dies by pushing down the pillars of the temple, killing more of the Philistines in his death than he did in his life. And dearly beloved, this is seen as a foreshadowing of Jesus' death on the cross, where his ultimate sacrifice serves as a victory over sin and death, defeating the enemy. And the story also holds symbolic weight beyond a direct parallel to Jesus. It is often interpreted as a microcosm of Israel's relationship with God and a lesson about the consequence of human frailty and the steadfastness of God's plan. But Samson was also a deeply flawed hero. I think this is why there's layers, there's multiple types in Samson. Samson was, well, like you, most of us, you and I, he was deeply flawed, repeatedly ruled by his own desires. That's the flesh. He breaks his Nazirite vows and he gives in to temptation. But despite all that, God continues to use him. That's interesting. To achieve his purpose of delivering Israel. This is a powerful message about God's ability to use imperfect people to fulfill his sovereign will. It says a lot about how Christianity views the lukewarm or inactive Christian today. Now, when Samson loses his strength, he's blinded and he's taken to Gaza to become a slave. Wow. And that's often interpreted symbolically. Samson's physical blindness reflects his prior spiritual blindness, his failure to see the consequences of his actions, and his reliance on his own strength rather than God's. Isn't that interesting? His enslavement represents the bondage that sin creates in your life and mine. The Philistines, who occupied the coastal region of Canaan, including modern-day Gaza, are often seen as a symbol of the world's opposition to God's people. Their name is even etymologically, the etymology of the word is linked to the name Palestine. Don't go around saying that too loud. But that's a fact. The historical and geographical context of the ancient Philistines' oppression of Israel is being seen in this current conflict. It continues to be a point of reference for many modern theological discussions. This is a direct prophetic link to modern political conflicts, even though Samson foreshadowed Christ. So Samson's a big figure in this. Samson can also be seen as representing Israel, I think. I don't have too many people that agree with me on that, but interpretations of biblical texts vary, we know, and some religious and political commentators do draw a direct line from the biblical accounts of Samson and the Philistines to modern political conflicts in the Middle East and even Israel. In particular, Samson and Israel are prophetic parallels. The view that Samson represents Israel in the modern era is really a well-established theological and political interpretation. Samson's superhuman strength, which he uses to defeat his enemies, is seen as a parallel to the military strength and the technological power of the modern state of Israel. His ability to single-handedly defeat armies of Philistines, that's interpreted as a metaphor for Israel's ability to defend itself against numerically superior adversaries. And just as Samson was surrounded and betrayed by the Philistines, this view suggests that Israel today is surrounded by hostile nations and faces internal and external betrayals. The biblical accounts of Samson's conflicts with the Philistines in Gaza are seen as directly prophetic. The final scene in the temple, the temple of Dagon, where Samson sacrifices himself to destroy the Philistines in Gaza, is interpreted by some as a prophecy of a future conflict in the region that will end in a similar climatic fashion. That's the view this channel holds. That's the view this pulpit holds. And this interpretation often connects the ancient Philistines with the modern-day Palestinian people. I don't care what others say. It does. Many theologians and scholars, including within Christianity and Judaism, argue against that, a direct, literal, prophetic link between ancient biblical narratives in general and modern political events. No, Steve, can't do that, because, and why do they do that? Well, because they ignore the verified reality of foreshadowed events, types. Typology is a method of biblical interpretation that sees a deliberate correspondence between people, events, or institutions in the Old Testament and their fulfillment in the New Testament. The Old Testament element is called the type, while its New Testament fulfillment is called the antitype. You're familiar, most of you are, with examples of that. Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the fish. That's a type of Christ's 3 days in the tomb, which is the antitype. And in the same way, Adam's called a type of Christ, Romans chapter 5. Because just as Adam's disobedience brought sin and death to humanity, Christ's obedience brings righteousness and life. First Adam, second Adam, or as I prefer to call it, say, last Adam. Not going to be a third. Old Testament events are historically real, but also they carry a deeper, divinely intended symbolic meaning that points forward to Christ and his work, as well as on beyond. I'm going to say to the end of days. Applying this typology to the story of Samson, many Bible teachers use this method. Mostly, they argue that the narrative is not a literal geopolitical prophecy for the modern state of Israel. Instead, it's a type that points to, just the reality of that it's fulfilled in Christ, but then they say Samson's flawed. Well, we got a little problem there because Jesus wasn't flawed, but folks, there's enough type in here to see what's going on and how it relates to what's going on today and how it relates to Samson and his time period and the events that surrounded Samson's life. They would say that the Philistines, as the oppressors of God's people in the narrative, are a type of the spiritual enemies of all believers, namely sin, death, and Satan. I don't have any problem with that. That their defeat at the hands of Samson foreshadows the ultimate defeat of these spiritual enemies through Christ's death and resurrection. I don't have any problem with that. I don't know why we're stopping, because it has so many connections to end times prophecy. So, in their view, the prophetic link's not a literal connection to modern politics, but a theological connection that reveals God's consistent plan of salvation throughout history. I have no problem with that, which all culminates in Jesus Christ. And so that narrative that allows that perspective allows the narrative to retain its theological importance without being directly applied to modern day geopolitical conflicts, which they argue that's not the original intent of the passage, Steve. I disagree. The Middle East, and now global conflict, is about, and listen to me, it's about an ancient and particular seed, an historical blood feud that involved blessings, cursings, covenants, the seed that Christ sowed versus the seed that the enemy sowed. It's about divine election. It's about Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. It's about Ishmael versus Isaac, the free woman and the bond slave, Sarah and Hagar. Even the United Nations plays a role, as does the deep state and the utopian view of a global new world order as a whole. Yet it's centered around the very city of Jerusalem, the conflict between good and evil, God's people and Satan's counterfeit. That's what it's about. It is something which has plagued humanity from the start, and it will end in total victory when the King of Kings returns to deliver his people, judge the ungodly, and establish his kingdom on earth forever. That is what we see going on. And every generation who's ever lived through its own essential features of this much larger phenomenon, if you want to call it that. I suggest the current global conflict is the culmination of an ancient and ongoing spiritual battle rooted in biblical narratives of divine election, blessings, and curses. It's a core tenet of certain theological frameworks, particularly within eschatology and Christian dispensationalism. And I understand everyone's not a dispensationalist. They want to say the church has replaced Israel, replacement theology. That's, folks, two seeds. It's about the idea of a divine seed and an enemy seed comes from the interpretation of Genesis 3:15, where God tells the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and hers. Okay? If you want to take it all the way back, that's where it goes. That's often seen as the foundational prophecy of the conflict between the righteous seed, ultimately Christ, and the wicked seed, the Antichrist, and his followers. In this view, this spiritual conflict manifests throughout history, including in the current era, our time, today. Divine election, historical feud. Biblical narratives like Jacob and Esau and Isaac and Ishmael are historical examples of this divine election and the resulting feuds. You got to understand this. When you look at it this way, these historical rivalries are not just family squabbles, okay, but they are divinely ordained and prophetically significant. Folks, the promise to Abraham is seen as passing through Isaac and Jacob, not Ishmael or Esau, creating a lineage of faith and a source of conflict. And Jerusalem is the epicenter. The city of Jerusalem is central to this interpretation, serving as the literal and symbolic focal point of this spiritual battle. According to many prophetic interpretations, Jerusalem is the place where the final battle will center, where the Messiah will return and from where he'll rule. The ongoing conflicts surrounding the city are seen as direct evidence that the end times are drawing near. Folks, he's at the door, okay? This view incorporates modern political entities like the UN and the concept of a deep state and New World Order. I have every right to bring that into this discussion because it plugs in. Entities aligned with the enemy's seed and working to establish a global government that will oppose God's people and pave the way for the Antichrist. We're seeing the demonstrations on our TV. Unless you haven't turned your TV on lately. Folks, the conflict is framed as a struggle between God's people and Satan's counterfeit. It's a spiritual warfare where the physical conflicts that we see are merely the visible manifestation of a deeper, unseen battle between good and evil. The view that I'm proposing here sees Satan as a master deceiver who creates counterfeit religions, counterfeit governments, and spiritual movements to lead people away from God. The ultimate resolution being centered around the second coming of Jesus Christ. His return is not just a hope. Folks, it is a guarantee. Oh, I hope I get, some money in the mail today. That's wishful thinking. Guaranteed expectation. It's a future event that will culminate in the total victory of good over evil, where God judges the ungodly and establishes his eternal kingdom. This provides the framework for understanding all current events, all of it, folks, as part of a larger divine plan with a predetermined victorious conclusion. And you got front row seats. This interpretation is a powerful and a coherent way of understanding what's now going on. It provides a sense of purpose and meaning to historical events, seeing them not as random occurrences. Steve, that sure was a coincidence. No, they're pieces of a divinely orchestrated plan leading to the return of our blessed Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I love you all. I truly do. I got to stop before I start yelling so loud the neighbors hear me. Rest in him. He's coming for us soon.